Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Crop Tech Consults. So to piggyback on last week's segment about closing wheels, this week we're going to talk about down pressure, and more importantly, the role down pressure plays in ensuring that we get that seed trench closed properly. Alright, so if we talk about the role of the closing wheels, basically we have these two lobes that were split by the disc opener, drop the seed in, and the closing wheel is trying to take these two lobes of soil and push them back together. And when we're closing that closing wheel, we try to think of closing from the bottom up. So we want to close in and around that seed and all the way to the surface. If we close just at the surface, we leave air pockets in and around the seed, which obviously isn't good. But we want to close completely around that seed to where if we dig a side profile of that trench, we find that seed and we cannot tell how that seed even got planted in there. There'll be no seam up to the surface. There'll be no air pockets. Everything would be nice and uniform around that seed, basically tucked back in as if we were never there. We pull into a field, say like this picture right here, and we drop the planter in the ground and we take off and we do our profile digs behind it, and all of a sudden we notice we're finding air pockets around the seed, we're finding a trench or a seam all the way to the surface. Here we see that we're closed on top, but we're leaving pockets down below, and we realize that as this dries out we could actually open that whole seed trench back up, which would be a nightmare. So here we're evaluating, we're not closing very well. The first thing a lot of guys want to do is take that tail wheel pressure on the closing wheel and max it out. We need more pressure on the closing wheels to try to get that closed up better. Alright, and then after we try that and say it doesn't work, then we're going to determine that this field is probably too wet to plant. And obviously there is some tacky conditions out here. It's somewhat marginal ground the day we were out here. But we go 3 rows over and we do a side profile dig on that, and the seed trench looks like this. All of a sudden that seed's tucked in there. We can't see how it got there. We got a nice uniform environment. There's no seam, there's no sidewall smearing. It looks perfect. And realize that that's just a few feet away from where that last picture was taken. The difference though is down pressure. In that first picture we're carrying 400 pounds of down pressure. In the second picture we're carrying 100 pounds of down pressure. So realize that, remember, we're trying to close those lobes back up that the disc opener split. As the gauge wheels go across it, if we're carrying 400 pounds of down pressure, we compress those lobes, which makes the closing wheel's job a whole lot more difficult trying to get those lobes pressed back together in and around the seed without leaving air pockets, without leaving seams, without doing any smearing. So realize that down pressure plays an important role there. The looser we keep those lobes, the easier they're going to go back together, especially when we get into marginal conditions, because in marginal, wetter conditions, differences in down pressure are going to make a bigger difference on how much those lobes actually compress. So in this field here, at 100 pounds of down pressure, or say at 400 pounds of down pressure, we're going to say it's too wet to plant. But at 100 pounds of down pressure, we're going to say, actually, it's planting really good. Everything's tucking in there. We're not seeing the smearing. And we didn't change our closing wheel pressure at all. It's all talking about row unit down pressure changes. Now, this is assuming that 100 pounds of down pressure is enough to keep that row unit engaged on the ground contact the whole time. If we cannot keep the row unit engaged in the ground, we're going to have issues. We're going to have depth issues. We're going to have row cleaner issues and everything in between. So when we're getting into the field, the first thing we do when we get into a field is set the down pressure. Alright, before we set row cleaners, before we set seed depth, before we set closing wheels, we make sure we're getting adequate down pressure. And the right amount of down pressure that we want is enough to keep that row unit engaged in the ground at all times, but that's it. So we don't want to carry a huge amount of margin on top of that. We want to carry just enough that we can, and in marginal conditions that's very important. Enough to keep it engaged all the time, but not carry any extra if we don't need to. Alright? So with pneumatic down pressures, with hydraulic down pressure systems today, we can really dial in some of these down pressure settings. We can add 20, 50, 30 pounds, whatever we need, instead of the older systems where we're moving springs around and we're making 100 pound notches before, or 100 pound changes, I guess, at a time. So realizing that 100 pounds may be too light, but 150 pounds may keep our row unit engaged in the ground and may still provide the perfect conditions to be able to get that closed up, that soil closed up in and around the seed. And realize that a field that on that first pass looks way too wet to plant, we can adjust the pressure on the closing wheels all we want. At that 400 pounds, we're not going to get a satisfactory closing of that trench. But all of a sudden we lessen up that down pressure as long as we keep it engaged on the ground, keep a nice footprint, keep our row cleaners engaged, and all of a sudden it closes up beautifully for us. So keeping down pressure just enough to keep it engaged all the time. We're going to do that first when we come into the field, but realize that in marginal conditions, carrying too much down pressure on the planter is going to make the closing wheels jobs quite a bit harder. And in this situation here, say at 6 miles per hour, 150 pounds is not enough to keep that row unit engaged all the time. We're getting a lot of bounce. The faster we drive with the planter, the more that row unit's going to want to come out of the ground. So the slower we drive, the easier it will be to keep ground contact at a lower down pressure setting. So maybe in this field, at 150 pounds of down pressure, we can close that row, we can get it closed around there, but we realize at 150 pounds of down pressure, to be enough to keep ground contact, maybe we have to plant at 3.5, at 4.5 mile an hour. We have to slow it down a little bit to be able to keep that row unit in the ground the way we want it and still get the closing that we need. So all of a sudden, we take a field that maybe was too wet or marginal when we get there, and by lessening the down pressure, slowing down a little bit, all of a sudden we have a field that's actually planting very sweet. Just realize that when we get in the field, setting down pressure first before we do anything else is key. Making sure that we keep that ground contact all the way through the field, and realize that the role that down pressure is going to play when we go to try to set your row cleaners properly, your seed depth properly, and your closing wheels as well. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week. Remember to tune back in next week for the next edition of Crop Tech Consults.